Reproducibility Network is sponsoring these sessions. I'm the local network lead for Leeds. My name is Eike I'm a lecturer in politics and media at Polis, the School of Politics and International Studies at Leeds. Again, I'm very happy to have you all here today, and I'm especially happy to welcome our guest speaker today, Dr. Kahryn Hughes. Kahryn is an associate professor of sociology at the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds, and she specializes in research methods, innovation, development and training. And it's fair to say that she is a real authority with regards to the sometimes thorny issues around qualitative data archiving and analysis, which we will hear much more about today, and we'll have a chance to discuss in our setting today. So Kahryn is a co-editor of a recent Sage volume on qualitative secondary analysis, and she's been a senior fellow at the ESRC-funded National Center for Research Methods, where she has developed qualitative longitudinal and qualitative secondary analysis research methods for social scientists all over the UK. And it is this role which in turn is connected seamlessly to her work as a driving force behind the ambitious Timescapes project, which we will also hear more about today, I hope, which is a digital data repository for qualitative longitudinal research data. With that having been said, I will just hand over the virtual floor over to you, Kahryn. We are very thankful to have you today with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eike, for such a lovely introduction. So just briefly, this is a really quick presentation. It's designed more to provoke debate and questions. So hopefully people, find it provocative of new questions or looking at existing questions in new ways. So I'm going to be introducing methods and language of qualitative secondary analysis, and I'm also going to be introducing the Timescapes Archive here at the University of Leeds. And I'm going to, in talking about these two things, I'm going to be considering the challenges that qualitative data may pose for the intentions, the ambitions and the language and the practicalities of what we might be talking about as open science. Right. So today I'm going to be thinking through the challenges of open science for qualitative research and vice versa. I'm going to be considering the qualities of qualitative data in that regard. I'm going to give you a really quick introduction to methods of qualitative secondary analysis and a whistle-stop tour of the ethics of QSA, and an introduction, as I said, to the archive. So just thinking through open science and the context of this, there's been a global trend towards reusing existing data. So that's not only in the UK, but also European funding councils and other large international funding councils are requiring us to reuse existing resources, especially where those resources are data. We know that there's been a digitisation of everyday life, and there's been this phenomenal growth and tsunami of data infrastructures for capturing those data. We have begun to talk about ourselves as part of a global digital economy, in which we're both producers of the digital, but also as consumers, and Ritza talks about prosumers in that regard. Digital economies, they're innovative in and of themselves, but they also offer new and unparalleled opportunities for data-driven research innovation, and that's something that's very much at the forefront of all of our minds. Collectively, we're part of a fourth industrial revolution driven by changes in types, scale and availability of data. Sorry. So I'm not sure. There we go. So open science and open access are linked. that there's been Ike, has the slide changed to the next slide?
No, it hasn't.
We can't see. They've not moved on your screen either. They have mine.
I've now. Okay. Well, I can navigate myself through them, but given that you're the presenter, you should actually be able to take control of everyone's display.
Is that not changing? Sorry.
I think people. I mean, at least I can scroll through your.
Right. Okay. Here I'm changing on my PowerPoint and not on the computer, and I'm not sure why it's not doing that. So
yes, it's working now. Okay, good.
Thank you so much for those of you who have highlighted that. So there's been this global acceleration also towards open access, which involves the sharing of data and of knowledge based on those data. In the UK, our socially orientated research has been conducted with the public. It's usually funded by the public and is commonly conducted in the public interest. So I'm just thinking, for example, of the Economic and Social Research Council. That's exactly the conditions there of funding. And so the drive towards open, whether it's publication or data or whatever, has been based on this principle in its most general sense, that the benefits of research should therefore be open to the public in one form or another. So internationally, in a global knowledge economy, there has been a drive towards ensuring global parity through openness and the sharing of research and findings. And I think that this was absolutely exemplified by the rapid advances made in science globally throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, where that principle of openness and sharing was absolutely driven by the idea of shared interests. I'm not sure now why that has come off. So I'm very sorry, but there seems to be some sort of glitch. Would you, I emailed my presentation to you. Would you be able to pull that up and share? I'm really not sure what happened or why.
I'm looking for it right now. So.
Are you able to share via the window? You know, when you say share and you can click a window, you could share through PowerPoint there, maybe it'd be slightly different.
It's just not letting me do anything. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to carry on if that's okay, because otherwise we'll just spend quite a lot of time. So a lot of you will have heard this language, which is a university without walls, that we've all been encouraged to be part of a digital transformation agenda. That there is the language in university policy around international innovation through international partnerships. So even at institutional level, what we have is this focus on harnessing new opportunities for data-driven research. And these have been combined with mandates for certain forms of openness and sharing. And the overall tag is world-class research to address world-class problems. So in part, maybe I can navigate forward here. So in part, thank you. There are also, it's brought a huge host of challenges, and I'm going to focus on some very specific ones today. And these are very much around data reuse, because data reuse isn't straightforward, often because the data contains some form of qualitative content, and there's lots of sensitivities around those, specifically ethical and legislative. In its most simplistic iteration, quantitative data on social behaviours capture what people are doing, where and when, and in which combinations and over which periods of time. And qualitative data are often used to understand why people might be behaving in the ways that we can observe and capture quantitatively. And qualitative, we talk about qualitative research. Often people think about that as interviews, but the diversity of qualitative methodology is absolutely, it's almost infinite. It's really, really vast. Here are a few examples. So we might have focus groups, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, but participatory and action-based methods that can happen nationally, locally, internationally. There are a whole tranche of methodologies that draw on other disciplines. So, for example, oral life histories, storytelling, the use of photo elicitation and production of creative materials. The interviews, even when we talk about interviews, they're so diverse. They could be narrative or biographic or thematic, life history. And both through research, as part of a production of a research, as part of presenting on research, there have been this introduction of a whole range of creative methods, such as through the production of films, zines and animation. So qualitative research is incredibly diverse, as are the data that are captured through these different methodological approaches. And one of the things that's always struck me as a qualitative researcher is that when we speak to people and we ask them about their lives, they often respond by telling us. So they tell us stuff. We talk to each other, in research encounters. It's people talking to other people, and people tell us about the most intimate details of their lives. And qualitative research is really distinctive in that it captures this complex variety of what it means to be human across all social dimensions of our lives: work, family, friendships. So I'm going to give you a few little examples, a couple of trigger warnings: domestic violence and suicide in this one. But the point is that Josie talks about a time when she was in prison. We interviewed her as a midlife grandmother. She was in her 40s with a daughter who had 2 children, and also a son who had his own child. And she talks about how going to jail, which she did time for her husband's armed robbery, she took the rap, and how going to jail was redemptive and liberating because she was able to secure a divorce and get counselling. It was the first time in her life that she'd ever been able to talk about herself. She talks about the impact of having to be away from her children, but becoming a stronger person through that thing. In this one tiny slide, I think there were endless analytic opportunities. And I'm actually working on Josie's case for a book at the moment with Anna. So, but that's the traditional type of qualitative data. This is a relational map where somebody describes who they are and who other people might be in relation to them. This is a timeline, for example, from a young dad who talks about what his life is going to be like, thinking forward, plotting forward, an anticipatory narrative about being a dad and a granddad in relation to his new child, his very young father. And this is a future essay. This is a really lovely strategy that you can use in research with young people to understand what they elicit what they understand their futures are going to be. And here is someone who is able, in this tiny little extract, is able to tell us so much about herself. It's a girl. She's doing clarinet classes. She's doing Catalan. She wants to do forensic pathology. She even knows the university she's going to go to. And I think that she was about 14, between 12 and 14 when she actually wrote this. And future essays, you can capture these over time and understand how people's life trajectories unfold. So qualitative data are incredibly rich. They're very diverse. They tell us absolutely the minutiae of people's lives. And in this way, they present challenges for sharing data, and it's the qualities of qualitative data. So, for example, under GDPR, they're not suitable for open access, so that they present in and of themselves, the qualities of these data present challenges for the language of open science and open access. They can't be shared in the same way as big quants. Somebody switched their microphone on. Thank you. Depth qualitative data can't be anonymized like big quants, because once you start anonymizing, you begin to strip data of their meaning. The preparation of qualitative data for ingestion into appropriate repositories or archives is hugely time consuming. It requires accuracy as well as dedicated support from data stewards. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And qualitative data ultimately require depth analysis, which is time consuming and painstaking. So one of the things that I wanted to just raise today is that qualitative researchers have been dealing with these complexities, the ethical, the practical, the emotional and political complexities of managing and analysing qualitative data for as long as there's been qualitative research. And methods for engaging with that, a language for that, and one such innovation is qualitative secondary analysis. So really briefly, qualitative secondary analysis, or QSA, it's the qualitative analysis or reuse of existing data, usually qualitative research data, that have been archived or found. They don't always need to be qualitative data. You might use quants to situate qual data. They don't need to be interview data. So, for example, future essays, those sorts of things have been used, and they don't even need to be what the research originators considered to be the research data themselves. So there's a whole tranche of work on marginalia, paradata and so forth, of using annotations and things like that, the data around the research data to make sense of research. So the reasons that we would use methods of QSA, they're very different, and this is also going to throw some stuff up for this particular network around questions of reproducibility, which is QSA is often used to answer, we'll do it to ask new questions that are completely different from the originating researchers. You might do it to do an intensive set of analyses on a completely different set of themes. You might want to explore or expand on an original project, use it as a springboard for a new study to develop empirical grounding for a new empirical direction. But you also might want to analyse existing data along a newly emerging data set. What's really important, what's really distinctive about QSA is that instead of trying to think through our relationship to participants, we're encouraged to think through our relationship to data. And that's a mantra really in QSA, because we need to be able to understand the theoretical work that's needed about how we are treating the data that we're reusing as a particular form of evidence. How and why is it able to inform on the questions we're bringing? And what are we able to say on the basis of that? What sorts of theoretical developments are possible? So that's, I think, quite a different language from a number of you here that you might use about your own research and about data itself or the work that you need to do. So QSA is also really about engaging explicitly with questions of temporality. So the temporality of the data, the context in which they were produced, and the temporal remove of whatever that might be of the reusers. So far, a lot of the examples I've used might be quite familiar to you who are qualitative researchers who may be thinking about what I would describe as depth to breadth analysis, working with small samples of data and then scaling up, building from small samples to large. But because of the new repositories, because of new software, because of all the technological and infrastructure developments that we've had, we've now got new methods of doing qualitative secondary analysis. And one of these is big qual, which is breadth to depth, where you work from large amalgamated data sets and funnel down. And this is a diagram from work from a team who have took out a whole load of data from the Timescapes Archive, cleaned it up, reorganised it, and have deposited it in the Timescapes Archive as a big qual data set. It's there for everyone to use for teaching, training and research. So obviously I've touched on it a little bit, but there are these massive ethical issues around QSA. And I'm going to come back to questions of time here. We need to think temporally. And for me, one of the big things that we need to do is commit to archiving in qualitative research. I think that's just what we really need to do. Because when data are archived, apart from being, really beautifully organised and easy to reuse, it means that those data, new and effective protections can be developed to protect researchers and research participants throughout the lifetimes of data, from securing consent in fieldwork to signing legally binding contracts for reuse by bona fide researchers. And when data are archived, we're able to see how data are used and by whom and over what sort of time periods. And this involves developing what I and my colleague Anna Tarrant would call a temporal ethical sensibility. And I'm going to draw on the work of Bren Neal, who was the PI of the original Timescapes study and was the director of the Timescapes Archive until she passed on that role to me. And she developed work with Libby Bishop, who was the senior archivist on the Timescapes programme and was a senior archivist with UKDA. And the language that they developed was around stakeholders, data stakeholders, taking a stakeholder approach in which people involved in the lifetimes of data can be described as the data stewards. And the implications of that mean that ethics, we can think of ethics as travelling along the lifetimes of data. So the ethical concerns they travel through different contexts where people have different relationships to those data. So they could be curators, library staff, software designers, participants whose interviews or data they are, the originating researchers, the reusers and so forth. There's multitudes of different people involved in those lifetimes of data. And this begins to engage us with thinking through this broader terrain of relationships that comprise not only research by particular researchers, but about the sorts of relationships that work across disciplines, that work transnationally and over time. That it begins to engage us with understanding research as part of the ongoing flux of human relationships and engagements globally. So it engages us with thinking through relationships and relationally. And here, when we move from a data ownership to a data steward model of stakeholder ethics, where people have different ethical stakes in those data and what they're going to be doing with those data, we can begin to address relationships that are specifically in place and over time through which those data are produced, curated and reused. So when we're thinking through the ethics of qualitative data sharing, it involves rethinking this language of data ownership, and it has implications for questions of open science. So in qualitative research, we share data ownership with our participants, recognise we're funded through public money, and we can protect data over time, keeping up with changing ethics. And another huge driver here is moving away from a rights-based model of ethics towards a social justice based model as well. And I'm drawing really heavily on Lena Denzik and her team, where here, and this is part of an agenda, actually, a political agenda, which is rather than by protecting people through silencing them by deleting their data or locking them down so much or treating them in ways that they can't be reused, and that which reduces their opportunities for their voices to be heard, we can instead protect their legacy. So moving from a protecting the individual to a protection of their legacy, because we're always going to be treating those data in an ethical way. We're always going to be anonymising and protecting confidentiality anyway. It's all of these additional ethical challenges that I'm talking about here. Storing and reusing data often means that those least likely to appear in archives or produce a digital fingerprint, they don't even have mobile phones, they don't have means, money or whatever it is, they don't. They're not in the interactional data, but they become more able to be heard. So this way we can ensure that researchers in the future can be more capable of engaging with that past. So very quickly, Timescapes Archive, it was a £5 million investment by the ESRC. It's an archive for qualitative longitudinal research. It's here at the University of Leeds. Some of the people in the room have been responsible for creating and sustaining what I think is an amazing resource, absolutely stunning. It's a satellite repository of UKDA, and here are some of the strategies that are in place. We regulate who deposits data and who uses those data, and we do that through legally binding contracts of reuse. We make sure that it's bona fide researchers only, so who are in institutions that will govern those through, for example, ethics committees and approval systems. And we control when they access data. We may place data under time embargo, which is a really effective means of protecting and not only the participants, but perhaps their relatives. And the researchers, protecting the interests of researchers who might want to be writing up from their study but are unable to for other reasons. We're able to introduce access controls to different layers of data, from open access to completely restricted. And we've got a really effective system of special permissions that's in place. So together, these mean that data users are very visible, both to the archive and to the data generators. So just to point out that archiving with Timescapes creates a published data set that is appropriately kite marked, and that might be used as a ref submission. And a kite marked data set commonly scores 4 stars in ref, just saying. So a well organized data set can be one of your ref outputs at a 4-star level, rather than a book that takes you for, takes you the same length of time. New and mesoscale qualitative longitudinal data studies, they're being archived all the time. It's the living archive. Smaller scale studies, including PhD data sets, have been archived and are being considering for archive. And also the Timescapes Archive sits at the heart of innovation for the university in developing the institutional research data repository. So finally, I'll go to that later, but just to say, I think for me, the shift is then one from open science and open access to open scholarship, whereby these sorts of strategies, archiving qualitative data and using these sorts of strategies, can foster longer futures of open scholarship. Okay, thank you. I don't know who's got control of it, but they can close it now.
That would be me. Apologies for the slight asynchronicities at times. I'm trying to follow along as well as I could. Thank you, Kahryn, for this wonderful introduction to Timescapes, and also into the broader issues surrounding qualitative data archiving and all the conversations that you've been having over the years, indeed. And I will, before we go to Q&A in a second, I will say that I particularly appreciate to bring you into the discussion we've been having at UKRN Leeds, because sometimes these conversations can be dominated quite a bit by people who are coming from psychology or otherwise quantitatively oriented in nature, and sometimes it may seem as if the open science movement have invented these conversations and these concerns and are the first to actually tackle all the challenges associated with reusable data and making data openly available and so on. Now, that's manifestly not the case, as we've learned from your presentation today, and so that's absolutely illuminating for all of us, I think, at UKRN to hear your perspective from your many years of work on these issues. So I'm sure people will have questions about what they've heard about in your presentation. So I will just open the floor to anyone who wants to ask any question to Kahryn, or just wants to bring up any issue for discussion. As you know, we are in an informal setting here. It's not, not a highly formalized talk here, but we're just a bunch of people discussing the issues on our agenda today. So
just to say, I covered a huge amount of ground really fast. So if anyone wants any sort of clarity on anything that I said, please do ask, because I'm aware that I seriously whizzed through about 2 decades of extensive debate in 10 minutes. So yeah.
So any questions, please just raise your hand or put it into the chat, and I'll be calling you up. Rachel, please.
Hi, Kahryn. Thanks, Kahryn. Thank you for the talk. One of the kind of dilemmas or interesting questions that we have working in repositories, I think that you touched on in your talk, is about the importance of contextual information and contextual, putting stuff around the data that you've gathered to make it more understandable and potentially more reusable. And in ways that perhaps, and again, you've said this, these could be entirely new research questions that weren't anticipated by the original research. I wondered if you got any reflections, having talked to other colleagues and thought about this, about how to approach that, because as you said, it's quite an investment of time and needs a lot of thought about gathering this contextual information that we can then look at and potentially repurpose and archive, and how you've approached that.
Yeah. There's two things that I want to say, and the first one is around the pragmatics of how we may collect and report on and archive and store contextual data. So one of the things, that we can build those strategies into research studies, so that I've always found things like interview notes that the interviewer takes and records after an interview and then adds in onto a transcript or appends to a case, which is, whatever data accrue to a particular person or family or locality. And those are always really, really great. So there are ways of recording through a study that can support other researchers. There are other things that you can do in an archive, which is, I think, so we've in the Timescapes Archive, we've got landing pages which have the details of the as a citation of the data originators, the original research team. And so often what happens is that they've written a number of papers that provide a lot of the contextual detail for the research, so in the method sections and whatever. So it is a case, QSA is really time consuming because it is a matter of, it's almost like data forensics, where you need to track back who produced this data set, what were they doing, what were the interview questions that they asked, can I find them? And all of those sorts of pragmatic documentations can be archived with the data set, and then the papers subsequently are discoverable. You can go and Google the authors and have a look at what it was that they published on the basis of the study. So that's that. There's a second element here, which is a methodological set of debates, and I think that all too often researchers seem to imply that findings are only generated through data. And I would vehemently oppose that, because that for me goes against what the term scholarship means, which is, we receive our disciplinary training, we do all of this learning and work and research in refining our questions and engaging with our participants. We've done a huge amount of research in that way, that we're always combining different sorts of data, either very explicitly or implicitly, in building our analyses, and only part of that is our fieldwork data. Often we're testing out ideas we've observed elsewhere in and through our data set. So for me, data sets are always only ever partial. I don't care how big they are. I just don't care. They're always partial. They're always fragmentary. Ros Edwards and Susie Weller have just produced 2 brilliant blogs for the Timescapes Archive talking specifically about working with fragmentary and partial data. Just please go and have a read. They're 3-minute reads each. I mean, seriously, really, really good. So we're always only ever working with a set of representations of the social world as social scientists. I'm a social scientist, so that always I'm socially orientated towards human-centered research. And we're always working across different, what I would describe as evidentiary terrains. And our jobs as scholars and as researchers is to account for those different forms of evidence and how we're bringing those together in order to produce explanation. Reusing a data set where we don't understand fully the context might mean that we lack some of that information, but we're always working at an increasing temporal remove. And so the challenge is, well, how are we treating these data as a form of evidence? That's what I meant. What are our relationships with those data? And what I have found is that often temporal remove builds in additional analytic opportunities. So while some things are lost, other things are gained.
Thanks, Kahryn. That's really interesting. So it's like coming back to the stakeholders. It's a lot of the effort and thinking is right at the beginning and curating and collecting materials together. But inevitably, a lot of the effort actually sounds like it's further Absolutely. Down to actually do the work bring the stuff together. And yeah, okay.
So that's always, you're welcome. So we're always working at a temporal remove, even when it's in a primary study. You know, the beginning of the study might be 2 years, from when you started, when you got the money, and actually you get the money maybe 2 years after you started writing the bid. So it's been a 4-year process before you even begin to write up. You know.
So that's super interesting, and I actually have a follow-up question on that. That relates to who it is who's having agency in this process of generating reusable qualitative data. So you've talked about various stakeholders. Now I'm wondering just how much. Does in the process of creating such data, are those various stakeholders responsible for doing what, and then in addition, including the participants in the original studies themselves, the primary researchers, future researchers perhaps, and then also the institutions, libraries, and so on, who have historically played a very big role and currently still play a big role in supporting data management and so on for researchers. So I would like to learn a little bit more about how specifically that all plays out for reusable qualitative data generation.
So I think there are two things here. So there's one where there's an intention to archive, and then there's one where there hasn't been an intention to archive. And I think the second is still under pretty vigorous debate, but the one where people have got an intention to archive, there is a data management document on the Timescapes Archive that was written by Bren Neal. I think it's a 2020 or 2020 document. There's a couple. It's the most recent, and in that there are all sorts of consent protocols that can be used in securing consent for one's data to be archived. And Bren did this lovely shift from informed consent to enduring consent, because informed consent in research, you know exactly how your data are going to be used, and obviously when you archive your data, that's completely impossible. People might be reusing your data to understand the use of the word I. It's like can be completely random. So it's not that you can give informed consent, but you can give enduring consent, and you can give enduring consent on the basis of an undertaking by the researchers that their data will always be treated ethically, and be, when they're archived, there are all sorts of access controls and additional ethical protocols that are in place. So what we've found as a team, Rachel, Brenda, everyone that's here working with the Timescapes Archive, that's been a really long term, that's been 15 years of a conversation. whereby, and of course, we've had the introduction of GDPR over the last 5 years, which has really changed and intensified the need for particular sorts of protections for qualitative data. So there are things that, again, that can be done, and then as time changes, as legislative context changes, they can't. Everything has to be built in retrospectively. And so for me, there are 3 approaches to ethics. There's one which is the prospective, which is what you build into a research study always. Then there's the reactive, which are all the ethics that that crop up, things that happen in a research study where you think, oh no, oh my word, I really didn't want that to happen. How am I going to manage it? And you do. And then, and often in dialogue with one's participants as well, and gatekeepers and so forth, when it's human-centered research. And then there's retrospective ethics, and I think that that's the one that people keep missing out. So that's why when I'm talking about a temporal sensibility, that's exactly what I'm talking about, is that when we begin to think about lifetimes of data, we're thinking about our relationship to data and what it is that we can do as times change, as legislation change, as social sensibilities change. How do we manage those data? Some sensitivities ebb away, so like in museums, people, they're looking at intimate diaries of living through war, and no one's worrying about any of this, all sorts of loss and bereavement and wound and this and emotional agony. No one bothers about it. It's not a worry at all, because time has removed us from those people. But there may be new sensitivities that emerge over time, and so I think that's why we have to think about that retrospective ethics, which is a futures orientated, actually, is absolutely critical.
Thanks for this, Kahryn. To me, it's absolutely fascinating to learn out of sort of that outside of my own little box of quantitative social research. There's a whole universe of a discourse that I think should absolutely be included and recognized into any conversations around open data, in which terms like enduring consent, retrospective ethics, and so on rarely ever figure. At least they're fascinating. Yeah. So that's absolutely eye-opening to me to hear.
Great, that's lovely.
So I do see a hand up by Kelly first.
Hi, Kahryn. Thank you so much for talking today. It's been really interesting. I just wondered about sort of your experiences with getting consent for participants to archive their data. Were they quite happy to do it? I actually did quite a similar study, and it was like an opt-out process. But I actually found that the vast majority of people did opt in, and they were actually really happy to do that. I just wondered what your experience was.
No, people absolutely, because one of the things about qualitative research is that you're asking people to give of themselves, and that's what I meant in my presentation, is that they do. People are unbelievably generous with their time, with their emotion, with their experience, with their commitment to your research, with a whole range of motivations that are quite unexpected and often overwhelming as a qualitative researcher. You have to go away and have a little think, to be honest, very often in a study. So when you asked would they like their data to be archived, it's almost like, well, of course. Of course, I want as many people to use this as possible, because, I'm investing in you. I'd like you to now invest in me. So there's this idea that you would only use it once off is like, no, it's not disposable data. This is, this is important to me. I want it to be important to you. There were 2 things, however, and I think 2 cautions. So there was a study done in I will say Scandinavia, so I don't have to nail myself to one particular country. Where they followed people up and said, that would you be happy for your data to be reused, and people were very happy that their data had been reused, and there weren't consents in place at the time, but their data had been reused, and there was a minimal number of people that were like, oh, okay, I actually would have liked to have been asked first, but the majority, it was like 99.5% literally of the study sample had been, well, of course, that's logical to me. But in the same way that data travel in time for the researcher, so do they for the participant. And a participant who may feel very passionately about speaking to researchers concerning their experiences of divorce, for example, may 10, 15 years down the line not want to be confronted with that story. They've moved on, their lives have changed, or they don't want really to be reminded of that. So often they do want their data to be archived, but they also then want those data to be removed from them. So there was a lot of conversation at the moment. So Anna Tarrant, really pleased to go and have a look at her future, following Fathers Further, her Future Leaders Fellowship research. They have developed a system of copyright with participants where participants retain copyright over their data. And I'm going to be interested to see how that works out over time, because it may well be that stories become increasingly difficult over time and people may wish to redact in the future what was okay at a particular moment. So I think there is still conversations to be had around, as things exist at the moment. People are super happy, but they don't really want you to come back.